Hey, welcome back to another video. In this one, I want to talk about CSS Grid, what it is, how to use it, and why you should be using it in perspective. Let's take a look. First off, what is CSS Grid? Well, it's a system in CSS for building web pages in a grid of columns and rows. And it's really flexible. It's also very popular in typical web design, not in Ignition, but just in regular web design. It's really popular because of how powerful it is. Like I said, it's flexible. It's also very simple, and it lets you pinpoint where components are going to be in your grid or in your page by specifying exactly where you want it in that grid and how much space you want it to take up. So let's take a look at this form that I have here. This is a form for adding and updating product records. And I just want to show you inside of my grid container here, all of my components are right here underneath my grid. Really easy to see everything and access everything. Everything's either a child of my grid or a grandchild of my grid. You see here I have flex containers for each of these form fields, but they just contain a label and whatever that field is. So I want to show you one other thing here. If I go ahead and launch my project here, I'm going to go ahead and reset this demo project. Reset this. Okay. So if I open up my form here on desktop, it looks the same as we were just seeing it in the designer, but I have my developer tools set up to view this page on a mobile type of resolution. So if I hit F12, you're going to see now this view is rearranged a little bit. Instead of having columns on the right here for the upload picture and the picture area, these are now down below everything else, and everything is really well formatted for mobile. I'll just go back to desktop so you can see what that looked like again. So to get started using CSS Grid, it's actually pretty simple. I'm going to go ahead and get started with a new view. I'll call this product form. So we're just going to make the same exact view, okay? So I'm going to make this I'll give it the page URL. I'm going to have it be a flex container. And now the first thing that I'm going to do is grab another flex container. Doesn't matter if you choose row or column here. Either direction will end up looking the exact same, but I'm going to grab a column, and then I'm going to change some of the positioning on this flex container. I'm going to make grow 1, shrink 0, and basis auto. Now I'm also going to change the name of this container to grid. And then to actually make it a grid, I need to add a style property, display. When you open up this drop down here, you get a list of values that Perspective is expecting for this display property. And you'll notice that grid is not one of them, but that's okay. It doesn't need to be in that list for it to work. So I'm going to change it to grid here, and then I'm going to add 3 additional properties that are specific to grid. And those are grid, template, columns. This is where we'll define the column widths of this grid. Grid, template, rows. We're going to define height of our grid rows here. And then I like to start with this property. This is grid, template, areas. And this is where we define where our components are going to be in the grid, how many rows, how many columns they're going to take up, and what area of the grid they're going to be in. So like I said, I like to start with this one. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to shrink my panel down a little bit because it's actually really handy to have a little bit of a text area when configuring this property. So you can see I have this icon here now to open this text area up. But before we get started on this, real quick, let's look at the finished form again, and let's count the rows and the columns. I have for rows 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. So yeah, this is actually a row right here. So I have 9 rows overall. And then for columns, I have 1 column, 2 columns, 3 columns, 4. Now that I know how many columns I have, I'm going to go back into my grid template areas. And the way that you define this is in sets of rows. Each row is going to have an area specified for the column in that row, and the columns are going to be separated by a space. I have 4 columns, right? And in the first row, I just have a header. So the way that I'm going to write this is I'm going to add quotes, and then I'm going to say header. And I'm going to say header 4 times for each of those columns. And you can interpret this by thinking that, in my first row, I'm going to have a header in each of those 4 columns. Now I'm going to create another row. And in this row, I have a product name field. So I'm just going to say product name, but I don't want this to span the entire grid. So to add some empty space, I'm going to use a period here and here for those empty columns. Now I'm going to keep going. I'm going to add my product description. Let's copy that, or let's actually spell it correctly, description. Then I will copy that and make sure I have that in there 4 times. Make a new row, and here's where it's going to get, so here's where it's going to be a little different. You see, I have this upload picture component. It's taking up 2 columns, but it's also taking up 2 rows. So let's see what that looks like if I add it into my grid template areas. Of course, I forgot to save, so let me quickly add this back in here. That happened because I clicked off of this text area instead of hitting OK. I think I still have that. Yep. Okay. So let's hit OK, and then let's look at the form. I'm going to have category in these 2 columns of this row, and then I'm going to have upload picture in these 2 columns of this row. Category, upload picture, like that. Now to get my upload picture on the next row, it's pretty simple. You just, well, let's see, what's my next row? It's going to be a supplier. So let's go in here and we'll say supplier. And there we go. So now my upload picture component is taking up 2 columns and 2 rows. And that's how you would set this up. I'm going to go ahead and jump ahead and finish adding this. Actually, I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's first add some of these components, and then I'll jump ahead, and I'm not going to set up each individual one, but I'll set these ones up so that you can see what that looks like. So oftentimes when I'm creating form fields, like you saw earlier, I like to get a flex column, and then I'm going to put a label and my form field inside of here. So let's get a label, and let's get a text field. Now, my preference is to size the text field or whatever form field that I'm working with to about 40 pixels tall and shrink 0. Then I like to set my label to shrink 0, basis auto. And then the entire container here, I'm going to make that shrink 0, basis auto as well. Now, this could be my product name. It could be my description, whatever I'm going to use a text field for. So what I want to do is add a style property to this container called grid area. And when I hit enter here, you're going to see this entire form field jump. See how that jumped down to the bottom there? That's because my grid is interpreting this grid area value, but it doesn't have value set up as a grid area in the actual grid template areas. So what I'd have to do here is just change this to product name or some other area that I've defined. And now it's going to jump where it thinks it should go in the grid. Because we haven't sized our rows or our columns yet, this is where it's placing it. It knows something needs to be above it, and we have some things defined below it. So it's sticking it right here. That's fine for now. Something I strongly recommend that you do is create a property binding on grid area and set this equal to this component's meta.name property. Because you're probably going to want to rename this component. You know, I renamed grid. Now this, I'm going to rename product name. And I'm going to name it the way that I have it set up as my area. And now my grid area is bound to that name. And if I wanted to, you know, make another text area, let's see, do we have another text area on here? Ooh, kind of. We have description. But all I have to do here is duplicate this. Now I have product name 0, right? And I'll do, actually, I think I did call it product description, right? Not just description. Yeah, so there's my product description now. And the reason why it's not going any farther to the right, again, is because we don't have our columns configured. We're not telling the grid yet how wide these columns should be or how tall these rows should be. Let's get our header in here, because I just realized we don't have a header in here yet. I'm going to say this is product form. I'm going to give it some styles. I'm going to say font weight 500. And we'll do a font size of 1.4, 1.2 M. Looks good. Okay, I'm going to set my shrink 0, basis auto on that. And I'm going to rename it header. And then I'm going to give it this grid area. And again, I'm going to make that the property binding to my meta.name. There we go. So now that's in place. Let's go ahead and update these labels as well. Product name. Let's call this description here. Okay, so next, let's get our category and our upload picture. So I'm going to duplicate this again, and I'm just going to change this text field out for a drop down. Okay. Now, my container here is called product description 0. So let's change this to category. That should update my grid area and put it exactly where it belongs. I'm going to change my label to category. And now let's duplicate this once again. And instead of a drop-down component, let's put in a file upload. There it is. File upload component. And then I'll change my label to upload picture. And then I'm going to change the name of this container from category 0 to upload picture. Right? Okay, and now for the first time in this grid, we're seeing two components side by side. Here's my first column, and then this is my second column. And that makes sense because, actually, it's not second. This is 1 and 2, and then this is 3 and 4. Because if you remember how we set this up, there's 4 columns. Description is spanning all 4. Category is just spanning 2, and upload picture is spanning 2. So our grid is pretty skinny at the moment. Let's see what happens when we add our next set of components. This one's going to be supplier, and it's also a drop down. So I just have to change my label, supplier. And then let's get in here and let's make sure that we have this file upload sized correctly. I'm going to give it grow 1 and basis auto shrink 0. So now we can really see that this is spanning both of these rows. Okay. Now I'm going to jump ahead and finish adding the rest of my components into my grid template areas and creating them on the page, and then we'll take a look at the next step after that. Now this is what it looks like when I'm all finished setting up my grid template areas. I'm going to hit OK here, and we're going to see all of the components that I've added jump into place. Except for my description, which is, I changed that to, well, I'm not going to change it here. I'll just change it here. Instead of product description, I'm just going to call this description. There we go. Okay, so we have everything kind of arranged how we want it, but just looking at this, it's not pretty yet, right? Things are kind of smushed together. There's not any spacing between these components besides what extra space is in each of these field containers. So what I'm going to do to add space really simply is come to my grid, add a new style property called gap. And I'm just going to add a gap of, let's say, 20 pixels. And you see that adds spacing between every component in the grid. Pretty nice, right? At this point, I'm also going to go to my root container and add a little bit of padding. Say 10 pixels of padding. That just gets it off the border of the page. It's a little personal preference. And that's looking good. Okay, so I'm going to start working on the grid template columns next. Everything is arranged the way that I want to. I just need to size these columns the way that I want to now. Okay, so the way that this works is the grid wants to know about the size of each of these columns. And I can really simply write this out by listing a size for each column. Something like this. I could say 200 pixels 4 times. You don't have to put quotes around this. You just put the different sizes in there and hit OK. And now you can see my columns are all 200 pixels. However, if I hit the play button and look at this, I have this pretty hideous looking scroll bar. You can see that things are growing outside of the grid, and there's a bit of an overflow issue. So the other part about this is because I sized these columns statically as 200 pixels, they will always be 200 pixels. They're never going to resize. It's never going to be dynamic. So what I want to do is I want to come in here and look at this. I do want some of my components to be 200 pixels. Let's say I want my first and my last column to both be 200 pixels because I want these buttons to be 200 pixels. And that's just a fine width for my price, and that's about it. That's the only other thing that's really taken up one column besides stock quantity. Anyway, I'm going to change these middle 2 columns, and I'm going to introduce a new unit type. You might not be familiar with this. It's called FR, and that stands for fraction or fractional unit. And what that does, I'm going to hit OK here. And you see how that shrunk these 2 middle columns down so that everything is fitting perfectly inside of the grid. Now, my first column is a little bit bigger than my second column, but these 2 columns are actually equally sized now. So what the fractional unit does is it takes the available space, not the total space, but the available space, and it assigns a fraction of that space to either the row height or the column width. And so now if I were to go to my view and grab this edge here and just resize that, you can see that this column here is resizing. It's getting a little bit smaller, right? It's getting smaller and smaller. Eventually it's too small. And this third column here is also sizing. This column and this column are exactly the same because they're both receiving 100%. One FR is 100% of its available space. Okay, so I'm going to set this back to 800. Now let's talk about the grid template rows. Actually, before I do this, I realized I left out some information when I jumped ahead. This component here is an image. It's intended to show whatever picture they've uploaded up here and show the resource location, right? And if you take a look at the styles on my image, I have this aspect ratio, 1 space / space 1. This is doing a lot of, this is doing some important work here by sizing this, this component as a perfect square always. So even if I shrink this down, you see it's shrinking not just horizontally, but it's also shrinking vertically as well. That's what that aspect ratio is doing. If you're following along and if you're trying to get the same, build the same form as me right now, that might have been something that was stumping you. So sorry I didn't include that earlier, but that's all that is. Aspect ratio is making sure that this is sized as a square. Okay, now grid template rows. This works just the same way as the columns. So I can just give it information about each of my rows, how tall I want each row, and I could go, one by one and just list them all out. For example, I could say 60 pixels for the first row, and that's going to make sure that this header here is 60 pixels tall. Now I could also go through and say I want my product name and maybe all of these other rows, I want these to be sized or auto-sized, right? So I could say auto, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 times, but there's an easier way to write this. And the way you do that is with a repeat. So what I'm going to do is say repeat, and then in parentheses, I'm going to say the number of rows, 6, comma, and then the height, which in this case is going to be auto. Now that takes care of this, and this row. But then I have this big row here, and then at the very bottom, I have this row here. So let's go back in here, and I'm going to add, for this big row here, I'm going to use 1FR so that it's taking up 100% of its available space on the page. And then the bottom, my buttons, that row will be 40 pixels. Okay, hit OK. And that looks good. Doesn't look too different, but that resized my my last row here so that these buttons are 40 pixels tall. And that looks pretty good. I like how it's coming along now. I do want to mention that sometimes when you're working with grid, you may encounter an issue with auto-sized rows and columns. And one easy way to address this, to mitigate this, is by using a min-max value. And so what that is instead of using auto here in my repeat, I'm going to say min-max, then I'm going to do a parentheses, and inside of there, I'm going to give it a minimum value and then a maximum value. So I'm going to say 62 pixels because I already know that that's about the height of my auto-sized label and my 40 pixel form field. And then I'm going to say for a maximum value, I'm going to say auto. And we're not going to see really, I guess we saw a little bit of a change, but for the most part, you're not going to see that affect things unless you're having an issue with auto-sized rows or columns. That's just something to know about. That's a way that you can mitigate any issues that you have there. Okay, so everything's looking pretty good. I'm going to save this now, and then I'm going to go to my page configuration and right-click my path and launch this so that we can see what this looks like in the session. And you can see that this is kind of right, but it's way too wide, right? If this is what we're going for, we still need to make a couple of changes. So let's go back in here, and this is why I wanted to make a new flex container for my grid instead of setting it all up on the root, because what we can do here is go to our root container, and then I'm just going to change my item alignment to center. Now, if I go back to my grid, I can add a new style property called max width, and I'm just going to give it a max width of 800 pixels. And I'm going to save that and look at that in the session again. And now we're pretty much spot on to where we want to be. Okay. But if I do the developer tool trick to see what this looks like on a mobile screen, you can see we're not really responsive yet. There's still something that we have to do to get this to look right on a different sized screen. Fortunately, it's very, very easy to do this. So I'm going to go back in here, and what I want to do is go to my grid, and I'm going to copy this style property, the entire thing. I'm going to copy that. And then for my classes here, I'm going to give this grid a class, and I'm just going to call it, I'll say product form grid. Okay, so that's my class. Now I'm going to go over to my styles in my project browser. And if I haven't already done so, I'm going to enable this advanced style sheet. Okay, if you're running version 8.1.21, I believe, then you should have access to this advanced style sheet. So in here, we're going to create that style class. We're going to define it here and add all of those properties. So one thing you got to know when you're creating styles in the style sheet that are styles classes you're applying in the designer to your components, you have to prefix them with PSC dash, like I have here. Can I blow this up? I can't increase the size here. Okay, so I'm defining my class as .psc dash, and then it was product form grid, right? I'm going to create open and closed curly brackets, and then I'm just going to paste in those styles that I copied in. Now I just need to reformat this a little bit, and to do that, I'm going to get rid of the extra curly brackets. And I also got rid of the classes property. We don't need that. And now I'm going to get rid of all of these extra quotes on each of these. Let's see here. You'll really only need to do this once when you're setting up the view. And just want to get rid of all of these quotes, all these extra quotes. And then instead of commas, where you have those at the end of each of these properties, you're going to replace those with semicolons, like this. All the way at the back here, replace that. Replace this one, and this one, and this one, and this one. Okay, let's just get that right. Now for my grid template areas, it looks a little wonky because we had it in that text editor and we had new rows. So it added in some extra quotes and extra slashes and this /n. So we got to clean this up too. So I'm going to get rid of this. And what I like to do is I actually drop it down to the next line, kind of like how we had it in that text editor. And I'm just going to clean this up. Get rid of all those slashes. And anywhere where you see a slash or /n/, get rid of that, get rid of it there. And almost done. And there we go. All right. Now you only need the semicolon at the very end of this property, okay? Now, if I've done everything correctly, I can go back into my form, to my grid, and I can delete these individual style properties. So I'm going to delete display grid. I'm going to delete, I can delete overflow, I can delete grid columns, can delete all of this stuff, and you're gonna see it gets all, you know, it's all changed, right? But I think it's because I didn't save. That's right. So as soon as I saved, it all jumped back into place. You do need to save after making changes in your style sheet. But if you did everything correctly, you should see with just this class applied to your grid that the grid is still working. Okay. Now that's step one. Step two, this is actually going to be really simple here. We are going to add a breakpoint. In CSS, it's a media query. It's what it's called. And so to make a media query, you do an @ followed by the word media, and then parentheses. And inside of these parentheses, you're going to give it a condition. And this condition for me is going to be max width. I'm going to set that to 550 pixels. All right. Now you're going to do an open and closed curly bracket, and then copy this entire class. We're going to paste this class into our media query, and we're going to redefine this class inside of the media query by changing our columns, our rows, and our areas. So because this is for a smaller screen, I'm going to cut out some of these columns. I'm going to get rid of 2 of them, we'll say. So I'm going to go through my areas. I like to start with my grid template areas, and I'm just going to get rid of the last 2 columns. And for this upload picture, I'm going to create a new row for this down here and get rid of it there. And then again, for this picture, I'm going to go down here and make another area, another row rather for that. Get rid of it here. And then let's get rid of this empty space and this empty space. Now let's check. Header, product name, description, category, supplier, price, stock quantity, status, upload, picture. I have picture in there too many times, don't I? Did I mistype any of that? Status. Okay, I think that's right. I don't think I'm missing anything. Now I can change my columns, and I'm just going to give my columns each 1 FR. And for my rows, let's see, I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 rows. So my first row is still going to be 60 pixels. And then my last row is still going to be 40 pixels, but I don't really need this 1 FR. I'm going to change this to an 8. And I think that's all I need to change there. Moment of truth. I'm going to save. And then I'm going to go to my session. Here we're looking at it. See, this is the new one, my CSS grid project. This is the preview one that I already pre-built, YouTube projects. So here we are. If I hit my developer tools, booyah, we got it in mobile view. Do you see how easy that is to set up? And you can set up as many of these media queries as you want. I just love how powerful that is. It's so simple, easy to manage. I really don't even need to get back into this view to edit any of these components and change their positioning ever. I can add components into here, but then it's just everything is managed right here. So I like to create a little comment for what page this is for. This is for my product form. You know, I might make another grid on my product management page. And then I would do the same process. So let's review. CSS grid, why should you use it in perspective? My top 2 reasons are because it's simple. It just simplifies everything, especially when we're talking about this view structure. Everything is visible, really readily visible underneath your grid. You don't have to go digging for components, and that's especially true when you're going to add logic to your view. Let's take a look at our script for save. If I wanted to come in here and create a save script, actually before I do that, let's take a look at one of these form fields. Something that I really commonly do is I'll come to these containers here and I'll add a custom property called value. And then I'll bind this to whatever field is inside of the container. This will be my props.text. For category, you go value and then bind this to the drop-down props value. And now back on my save button, it's really, really simple to get my variable set up for the logic I need in this script. So I'm going to say, product name is equal to, and then let's just dig for our product name. Go to custom value. Oops, clicked off of that too quick. This is what that looks like. And it's so quick and easy to just change this. Make a quick change. This is going to be description. Let's change that to description. The path to the value for all of these is going to be the same. And so it just kind of speeds up the development. It's so much simpler and easier to manage. That's number one, why you should be using CSS Grid. Number two is because, as we've seen, it's very flexible. There's a lot that you can do with it. The ability to pinpoint where you want those components in your grid, how big you want them to be, and then also to make a completely different layout for different screen size and as many as you want. It's just, it's awesome, right? I really like using CSS Grid for its simplicity and its flexibility. But one other reason why I think that you should be using it, my personal bias, is it just looks good. Everything kind of lines up the way that you want it to. I don't have to get into any of these individual components and add margin or padding or mess around with the positioning at all. It just kind of is going to fit. And I love that about this. So that's all I have for you today. I hope that this video has helped you. And, I'd appreciate it if you liked the video, subscribe to the channel for more, and then we'll see you in the next one.